What's up, gang? It's Dustin Cruz again, and today we're talking about exporting 3D assets from Chief Architect. Some of the reasons you might want to export from Chief is if you're making a model and you want a good starting point with a 3D mesh. If you want to go out to third-party rendering apps such as Lumion or Unreal, Corona Renderer, there's a whole bunch out there you might want to try out. If you want to do some 3D printing, that's also an option. And sometimes a client or an architect just needs a certain format and they don't have Chief installed, or they want to use a collada, .obj, .stl. There's lots of formats out there, and some people are just more comfortable working with different kinds of formats. So I have a plan. Let's look at the grand view plan I have over here. And if I go up here to File, Export, all of my 3D formats are grayed out because I'm looking at Plan View, which is a 2D view. So if you want to export 3D, you have to look at 3D. So I'm going to get my camera tool. I'm going to drag this out here. All right, now that my 3D camera's popped up and I've got a good 3D view of my house, if we go over back to File, Export, you'll see all my 3D formats are now available for export. And real quick, just want to mention that everything you see in this camera view is going to be exported in 3D when we export, whatever format we choose. So if you want to do different models, different types of 3D exports, you can set what you want to see with your layer sets up here. So if I just wanted to do a 3D framing set and export just the geometry for my framing, I can do that by selecting this, and then it'll roll over into my framing set. So now when I export, it'll give me just the framing. So let's go back to everything on. Just real quick before we do an export, I wanted to mention that when you do an export, you're going to lose the chief intelligence behind our objects. Things like our doors, our windows, our roofing, our cabinets. These are all objects that carry options within Chief, and we're stripping those out and just leaving the 3D geometry. So your cabinet will come out just how it looks in this plan view, but once you're in a external third-party renderer, or if you're printing, or if you're in 3ds Max or any sort of modeling suite, you won't be able to double-click the cabinet, open up the cabinet specifications, and change the door style. It'll just be a dummy cabinet. It'll just be a 3D box. So now that that's out of the way, let's do a full export. I'm going to go back up here to File, Export, Collada. And I usually export as Collada because it has the least amount of headaches that I've found, and that's not a detriment to the other formats. Every format has its uses, but when you're going between one 3D software to another 3D software, there's always going to be some handshaking. There's a little dance you got to do to get it to work from point A to point B. And you'll see what I mean when we open this up in a new 3D package. But for now, let's just export as Collada. And we're going to save this as our full home export. Hit OK. You'll see the export dialog come up. It'll work a little bit and spit out your model. All right, now that we got that one exported, let's do one more as the 3D framing set. So I'll go back up to my layers, swap to my framing. Then it's going to be the same process. We go to File, Export, Collada Model, DAE, and let's call this one Framing Set. Export. We're going to load that model as well. Alright, that's exported. Let's go see what we got. Alright, so our plan came into 3ds Max. It doesn't look great. What's wrong with it? Let's take a look. Number one, and most obviously standing out here, are the trees. These trees don't have a transparency on their image anymore, and they don't rotate with the camera. And when I mentioned before about losing intelligence in Chief, if I go back to Chief, you'll notice that these trees have a transparency around all the leaves and bark and stuff. And they also rotate with the camera. Let me get above one so you can see what I mean. So it is indeed flat. When I rotate, see how it rotates with my camera position? So that intelligence is lost when we export out. So we just have the geometry, which is a rectangle. So yeah, it looks pretty bad. You can always delete them when you get to where you're going. If you go into 3ds Max, if you go into Unreal, if you go into Blender, you can always delete them there. Or you can go back to Chief Architect and turn them off in the visible layer sets and then do another export. That's usually the cleaner way to do something like this. So let's go back and do that real quick. We'll go back to Chief here. I'm just going to toggle the display on the plants trees here. Hit OK. All right, and now when I re-export and go back to Max, no more trees. So those trees are gone, and we found some extra geometry over here. And this is actually kind of helpful because one thing that's kind of complex but kind of useful is that all these objects in Chief, the walls, the floors, the windows, are all their own separate objects. But once you export them, any object that shares the same material in Chief, when exported, will come out as its own object. And that sounds kind of complex, but this is all I mean, is that any object that shares the material with this wall, any object that shares the roofing, any object that shares the material of the concrete, all of this is one geometric object. So having geometry on the side isn't a bad idea because you can use it as handles to grab objects. I can grab my concrete, and any object in Chief that shared that concrete material is now one object. I can take a look at this. I can back out. I can grab this, and that's my walls. Take a look at those. So not too shabby. Another thing that couldn't go wrong is we call it Z-fighting, and that's just like a flicker between geometric shapes. See how the subroof and the roof are fighting for viewing space? If I zoom in here, it's not so bad because the computer can handle it better at closer ranges. When I pull back, it gets pretty gnarly. Depending on what software you're importing into, some things handle this better than most. You can turn that off in Chief before you export, or you can delete it here. I usually like to fix this in Chief. You can use the same display method where you toggle off the display for that material, or you can open up your roof planes and go to Structure, Surface, go to Edit, My Subroof, and just delete it. Hit OK. All right. And now when I bring this back into 3ds Max, there's no more Z-fighting because the subroof is gone. Okay, the model's looking pretty good, but let's double check our framing set too since we exported it from Chief. This one looks a lot cleaner. There's a lot less going on. That came in pretty solid. I would use that for a 3D print or a render in Lumion or Corona. I think that looked pretty good just straight out of Chief. And I just wanted to mention some other things in closing. Lighting does not export out of Chief. Your light fixtures, your lamps, your chandeliers, street lights, headlights, all the geometry will come out, but the intelligence behind the actual light data itself will not. So whatever program you're going into will need to be relit. So if you aren't planning on rendering in Chief and you plan on doing an export and rendering in something else, I wouldn't worry so much about my lighting in Chief. I would just kind of mark out where I want my lights to be, where my lamps are, where my light sources will be, and then add them at a later date. And the same goes for cameras. If you do a walkthrough spline, that will not carry out of Chief. Your saved cameras will not carry out of Chief. So it's always good to use them in Chief for your workflow, but be aware they will not come out with your export. So that will about do it for me. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments or questions, you can call us or email us. Also, you can visit us here at chiefarchitect.com. And don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you. So thanks again, and I'll catch you next time.